Hello lovely people, my name is Emma and this is the 360 book review where I try and talk about a book for 360 seconds and give you a full 360 view of all my thoughts on it. Today we are taking on the absolutely epic, iconic, complete chunker that is War and Peace by Leo Tolstoy. So I have finally finished this book. It took me just over 2 months to read it. This particular edition is coming in at a whopping 1200 pages. And if you are unaware of what War and Peace is, this is a classic Russian novel which was written, I'm not sure exactly when it was written, but the story is set in the time of the Napoleonic War. And it follows 2 to 3 major Russian families of sort of varying levels of sort of upper classness and their experiences across quite a wide time period. I think it spans about 17 years in the end, sort of done in 3 different intervals of timings. The first one is focused on, so it's broken into 4 volumes. The first half of it is very much focused on the initial conflict with Napoleon, where Napoleon definitely comes out on top, defeating Russia in war. Then there's sort of a stalemate truce for a little bit. Then there is the big pushback against Napoleon, who as he tries to march and basically ends up taking over Moscow, and it's them trying to push him back out. And then there is a little brief sort of epilogue-y bit at the end where we get to see our characters after the war is officially over, a good kind of 7 or 8 years after that, and see what they're up to there. It has a huge cast of characters and has a really lovely combination of sort of micro looking at their individual relationships, and sort of, again, it's mainly kind of family drama, who's marrying who, sort of the fortunes that are being made and lost for these various sort of Russian nobility, and then also a more macro look at Russia as a whole and sort of the philosophy of war as a whole as such. So why on earth did I like this book, and is it genuinely worth the 1200 pages? I loved this. I was completely infatuated with it. It took me probably, so I listened to this on audiobook, full disclosure, and it took me probably a solid 4 or 5 hours to get into it. The first beginning chapters, you're meeting a lot of people. It's a little bit overwhelming. You're not sure who is important and who is secondary and who is tertiary. And Tolstoy can kind of belabor a scene quite a lot, especially at the beginning. Then once you kind of fully get into it and we get past the first initial like military interactions and the soldiers start to come home, and we really get to see, as we spend more time with very specific characters, who is important in the story and who was more just kind of window dressing at the beginning, that's where I really felt like the book started to flourish, and we had some really wonderful interactions. And what I loved about this book was, with the characters, there wasn't really an obvious sort of villain. There was no kind of like heel baby face. It was all very, everyone sort of ended up playing roles where I was really frustrated by them, but then was also won over by them afterwards, but then went back to being frustrated by them. There wasn't like an obvious hero-villain narrative arc. And there were definitely some who were more villainous, but they really had very fleshed out, well-rounded human characteristics that made me really sort of feel for them at various different points. There's some very dramatic moments, which is fantastic. There's a really dramatic duel at one point. There's a fantastic gambling scene that I loved. And there's a lot of intensity of sort of heartache and people who are, you know, forming relationships and then breaking these relationships, and there's scandal, and there's all sorts of stuff about people's reputations, which I greatly enjoyed. The other side of this book is the military side of things, which I actually really enjoyed. And when you read the reviews on War and Peace, quite often people say that they enjoy the character stuff, but they found the like more macro war stuff a little bit dull. Whereas for me, I actually enjoyed, as the book went along, Tolstoy inserted himself more and more as this sort of omniscient narrator who goes on these long conversations about what does war mean, how much of history is determined by one man or a collection of men. Sort of when we say that we have great military generals and Napoleon was an incredible sort of militarily minded man, what does this actually mean and how much control does he genuinely have? And Tolstoy puts forward a relatively compelling argument quite repeatedly, but I do feel like he expands on his points each time, that actually Napoleon was not that special, and that men of war are not that special, and often armies succeed entirely based on the battle of the day and the troops on the ground and sort of the way that the spirit lands, rather than these big decisions made by generals when, especially at the time of writing and within the Napoleonic War, your lines of communication are deeply flawed. So possibly his theory doesn't hold up as much today, but in terms of back then, your ability to actually maneuver troops in the way that you had planned was deeply flawed and often didn't go according to plan. So like I say, I really enjoyed the war part. There was a whole conversation about, you know, men's propensity to war and the way that it is a common tool for social advancement, especially during the time, and the fact that often younger men will yearn for war as a way to be able to make a name for themselves, and the sort of weird dichotomy that builds into society when you have a huge collection of people who are actively striving for conflict purely for their own selfish reasons. So I really enjoyed those bits. I also deeply enjoyed the audiobook, and I really love the narrator. I do think this is a book that is going to be made or broken by the translation that you pick. This is the Penguin English Library this is the Penguin Modern? Penguin Vintage Classic. I know what I'm holding in my hand, be quiet. This one I didn't actually like to read. So I tried reading War and Peace a couple of years ago and completely failed, and I think partially it's because of this translation. There is a lot of French throughout War and Peace, as well as obviously the original text was written in Russian, but many of the Russian people of the time spoke French as sort of a marker of certain social status. The French were very highly regarded, and so was the French language. And this particular translation opts to leave in the French, but instead translate it in a footnote, which is horribly jarring to read and bloody awful. Whereas the audiobook I listened to didn't do that. It would just say so-and-so said in French, and then would tell you the English. And I really appreciate that because I feel like the flow worked a lot better. I loved the audiobook. It's 60 hours to let you know, so it is a major commitment. But the Audible original one is narrated by Thandie Newton, and she does some incredible voice work. Her Napoleon has the most absurd French accent you've ever heard, and I quite enjoyed it because the book is definitely poking fun at Napoleon as a character repeatedly. So for him to have a slightly more absurd accent than everybody else really worked. It's almost like the pantomime villain character. I guess the only I said there was no villains in War and Peace. There is. It's Napoleon. It's the only one. So yeah, so this is a slightly rambling review, but basically if you've been eyeing this book in bookshops, you know, it's one of these top 100 books you should read, absolute iconic classics, one of the longest fiction books out there, etc, etc, and you're really intimidated by this and thinking, is it worth it? I genuinely think it is. I had such a great time. It is probably one of my favourite classics now, and I wouldn't say that I wouldn't do a reread again at some point in the future, but you do need to be aware going into it that it is obviously going to have a lot of historical stuff. If you're someone who is not bothered by history or military history, you're going to find huge chunks of this boring. And one way to sort of approach this and to view it maybe a little bit sort of mentally better is to think of it more like, you know, when you have these big epic fantasy tomes and they're broken into books, but it's the same overarching plot. This is kind of like one of them just bundled up into a couple of them bundled up into one. Like, it's a very intense book, but actually I've read far more from George R.R. Martin than from this, and I think this is a stronger story than Game of Thrones. So that's kind of pretty much it from me. This is going to be longer than 360 seconds because it's such a chunky boy. It's like trying to talk about 4 books in one. So do let me know in the comments down below, have you read it? Do you agree with me? Do you think War and Peace is worth the time, or do you think it's 1,200 pages of just wasting your life and you should read 4 or 5 other books that you could totally get done in the time? Have a wonderful reading week, and I'll chat to you soon. Bye.